each individual both draws upon and contributes to the memory of the species. And perhaps most shocking of all, the idea that our own memories are not stored inside our brains. We tune into them. So these are all radical ideas. They're, of course, controversial. And they lead to a completely new way of looking at nature and the evolution of nature. Before I say a little bit more about the ideas themselves, I'm going to give a very rapid historical background, because I think that we're going to have to consider ideas like this, whether we like it or not. I like it, some people don't, but I think there's a change happening in science which is going to force a consideration of these. The change is the conflict between the two most fundamental models of reality in the Western world, in the scientific world. One is the model or paradigm of eternity, the idea that nothing really changes. The other is the idea of evolution, that everything changes and develops in time. And these ideas are now in head-on conflict. It's like two great tectonic plates of ideas colliding with each other. And these are going to change the way we think. Not instantly, but rather like tectonic plates, by throwing up sort of volcanoes and earthquakes of theoretical disruption going on over decades. So first, the historic background. The idea of eternity comes to us from ancient Greece. The ancient Greek philosophers were obsessed with the idea that the underlying reality of things doesn't change. And the different philosophers had different theories of eternity. Pythagoras and his school thought that the eternal reality was mathematics, numbers, ratios, and proportions. They were beyond space and time and gave rise to the world we live in. Plato generalized that to the idea that the world is made up of eternal forms beyond space and time that are reflected in the world we experience. He went beyond just mathematics. Every horse is a reflection of an eternal horse idea, for example. The ideas or forms are the ideas or forms of everything in nature, but beyond space and time. They're transcendent. Another school of Greek philosophy were the materialists. They said the eternal reality is matter. It's made up of lots of little bits, the atoms, that never change. Yet they can move around and recombine and permutate, and that's what underlies the world we live in. These ideas underwent a great revival in the 17th century. The founding fathers of modern science in the 16th and 17th century, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Newton, Descartes, all thought that what they were doing was discovering the eternal mathematical laws of nature, which were ideas in the mind of a mathematical God beyond space and time, that were reflected and worked out in the natural world. In the 17th century, there was a revival of atomism, and this gave the idea that the world we live in is made up of eternal matter and energy, governed by eternal laws of nature beyond space and time. And that's the foundation of the mechanistic worldview. The 19th century development of thermodynamics simply codified this. The principle of conservation of matter and energy says the total amount's always the same. The laws are the same, the total amount of things they govern is always the same. And this is implicit in science. Most scientists take this for granted, not because they've thought about it, but because they haven't. And it's simply taken for granted that the laws of nature are the same at all times and in all places. That's why scientific experiments are supposed to be repeatable anywhere by anyone. It's just implicit in the whole structure of science. The other great idea, the evolutionary idea, comes from the other part of our cultural roots, the Jewish people, and is the idea of a movement or progress in time. The Jews were the only ancient people who thought of history as a developmental process. The archetypal model was the journey of the people of Israel out of bondage in Egypt through the wilderness to the promised land, a journey, a movement to an end or goal. The goal was supposed to be the recreation of paradise, the land flowing with milk and honey. Of course, it didn't work out like then, because then as now, it turned out to be full of Palestinians. And there was just nothing but trouble. So the projected goal was projected into the future, the coming of the Messiah. In Christianity, it became the second coming of Christ, the rapture, the beginning of the millennium, a future event when history would come to an end and everything would be transformed. This idea, a progressive development of history, was secularized in the 17th century, first by Sir Francis Bacon in England. The idea that the world could be transformed not through divine intervention, but through man's own efforts, through science and technology, the conquest of nature. And this, by the end of the 18th century, was the standard Enlightenment worldview. Humans would transform the world through science, technology, and social reform, achieving conquest of nature, domination of nature, and the transformation of the world. And this is now the ideology of every government in the world: progress through science and technology and economic development. It's conquered the world as no idea ever has before. But at the end of the 18th century, it was purely human. The rest of the world was fixed. With Darwin's theory of evolution, this progressive view was extended to the whole of life. But physics remained wedded to the eternal universe, not only eternal, but actually slowly running out of steam, according to the second law of thermodynamics, until 1966, when physics adopted the Big Bang theory. Now the whole of the cosmos is evolutionary. Where does that leave the eternal laws of nature? Were they all there at the moment of the Big Bang, like some kind of Napoleonic code? Was the universe, how come the eternal laws in an evolving universe were already there? As my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the coming to being of the entire universe and all the laws that govern it from nothing in a single instant. But if nature evolves, why shouldn't the laws of nature evolve? After all, the concept of law of nature is a metaphor, an anthropocentric metaphor based on human laws, and human laws do evolve. In fact, the law metaphor is incredibly inappropriate for nature. It implies a lawgiver imposing laws. Based on the idea of God as the universal law enforcement agency, making sure that all nature obeys the laws. These are metaphors we don't really need. A much better metaphor in an evolving universe is habit. And that's the idea I'm suggesting. Nature is governed by evolving habits. There's a kind of memory in nature, and what happens determines what happens next. What things are as they are because they were as they were. There's a kind of collective memory in each kind of thing. How I think this works is by a process I call morphic resonance, which is the influence of similar forms on subsequent similar forms. The word morphe means form in Greek. So it's a kind of resonance of similar patterns of activity. And it gives a kind of memory to everything in nature, every self-organizing thing in nature. Doesn't apply to machines, they're not self-organizing. It applies to molecules, crystals, animals, plants, planets, solar systems, galaxies. All of these are self-organizing systems. And what I'm suggesting is that the forms of them are not determined in advance by the laws of nature. Instead, they depend on habits or memories that build up. So if you make a new crystal for the first time, it won't be determined, I'm saying, by the laws of nature. The standard view is that it is determined totally by laws that already exist. So the standard view is the first time you make it, the millionth time, the billionth time, it should crystallize just the same. I'm saying it won't. The first time you may have to wait for a new form to come into being in nature. The second time it will be influenced by the first crystals, by morphic resonance, anywhere in the world, or indeed the universe. The third time by the first and second. There's a cumulative memory that builds up. The result of this is that things should get easier to crystallize as time goes on, newly synthesized compounds. Actually, they do. Chemists usually explain this not in terms of morphic resonance, of course, but in terms of anecdotes. Their normal theory is that bits of crystals get carried from lab to lab by migrant chemists, usually on their beards. And these then infect crystallizing dishes. If there haven't been any migrant chemists, it's assumed they're wafted around as invisible dust particles in the air. So I'm suggesting this should happen even if you exclude migrant chemists and filter out dust particles. Some of the most interesting tests of this theory are indeed in the realm of crystallization. I discuss them in detail in the new edition of my book, which is now called Morphic Resonance, just out. And can't go into the details here, but there's a lot of evidence from chemistry that this seems to be happening. Now, the same happens in the biological realm. At the top is a normal fruit fly. Below it is an abnormal fruit fly, and you'll notice it's got 4 wings instead of 2. That's because the balancing organ there, the halter, has been transformed into an extra pair of wings. This can be caused by a mutation in a gene. It can also be caused by unusual environmental conditions of the eggs. If you expose the eggs to ether 3 hours after they're laid, some of the flies develop this abnormal form. Nothing to do with mutations, but more like thalidomide, abnormal forms due to chemical changes in the embryonic stage. If you keep doing that, generation after generation, more and more flies develop abnormally. And if you take a fresh batch of flies that's never been exposed to ether and expose them to it, you get far more abnormal than you would normally. So there's the tendency for abnormal flies, the more you get, the more likely it becomes. This is based on lab research summarized in my book, if you're interested in the details. But this same theory applies not only to form in crystals and in animals and plants, but also to behavior. Morphic resonance applies to the activity of nervous systems as well. And to cut a long story short, what it implies is if you train rats to learn a new trick in one place, like Bolton landing, rats all over the world should be able to learn the same trick more quickly just because the rats have learned it here. It should happen in New York, in Sydney, Australia, in London, just because the rats have learned it here. The more that learn it, the easier it should get everywhere else. Well, this seems an incredibly improbable prediction, but actually there's already evidence from experiments with rats that it happens. The best evidence, the longest series of experiments came from tests started in Harvard with rats, training them to escape from a water maze. This showed that subsequent generations learned quicker and quicker. This was terribly controversial because it suggested an inheritance of acquired characteristics, which is a taboo, a heresy in biology. The person doing it then, he was accused of unwitting genetic selection and so forth. He did the experiment again. In every generation, he selected the most stupid rats as parents of the next generation, which means they should have made more and more errors as time went on. In fact, they made fewer and fewer errors in subsequent generations, starting at over 200, ending up around 35. This is a huge effect. And because it was so controversial, it was repeated in Edinburgh, Scotland, and in Melbourne, Australia. Their rats started more or less where the Harvard rats left off. And the most interesting data were the Australian ones. They found the rats went on improving generation after generation, but not only the descendants of trained rats, but all rats of that breed were getting better. Something was going on. It wasn't genetic, because it wasn't passed on just from parents to offspring. They were all getting better. Now, there's evidence from other animal behavior research that something like this is going on. And it should apply to humans. It should be getting easier for people to learn what other people have already learned. It should be getting easier to learn windsurfing, skateboarding, computer programming, playing video games, just because so many people have already done it. Of course, although these things do seem to be getting better, there's many other variables. We could all think of half a dozen variables that could affect it. So to test this, you need to keep other conditions constant or have a standardized test. In the 1980s, I realized that this theory predicted that standardized tests like IQ tests should be getting easier, not because people are getting smarter, but because the tests are getting easier because so many people have already done them. And I was therefore fascinated when in the late 80s it turned out this has happened. It's been found all over the world. The psychologist who's done most of the research is called James Flynn, so it's now called the Flynn effect. And this shows the rise in average American IQs between 1918 and 1989. Almost a 30% increase. We're not talking fractions of a percent, we're talking big effects here. And there's now been many other tests for morphic resonance in human learning. One of them, a new one, was thought up by one of my sons. He was doing national exams in England. They all do them synchronized simultaneously, the same exam all over the country. This is for 16-year-olds. And he said to me one day, I and my friends have thought of a good way of getting extra marks without doing extra work. I said, well, that sounds good. How are you going to do it? And he said, by morphic resonance. So I said, well, how? He said, well, we're going to do the last two questions in the physics and maths papers, for example, first. And we'll go back to the first one. And so that means the first, second, third, fourth, we'll be about 10 minutes behind everyone else in Britain. So we'll get a boost by morphic resonance. So I said, well, that sounds really good, but some of your friends must have been morphic resonance skeptics. He said, yes, they were. And he said, but we worked out that if morphic resonance doesn't exist, we wouldn't lose anything. If it does, we'd get the boost. Well, they all did it in the exams. They all got A stars. Probably smart enough anyway, but it does give one of the ideas for testing it would be to change the order of questions in exams. Many other tests have been done, some of them with logos of foreign companies like the Chinese Coca-Cola symbol, things that people have been exposed to repeatedly. Do they get easier for other people to recognize? This test with logos was done at an Austrian business school recently. The results are all in my book, and showed, yes, indeed, that seems to happen. There is indeed a kind of collective memory. This is what the psychologist Jung proposed in his idea of the collective unconscious. And I'm suggesting something like that is going on all the time, not just in humans, but every species. Similarity is the basis of morphic resonance, and it means that most resonance will come from organisms that are most similar. The most similar humans are identical twins. The twin studies at Minnesota and elsewhere have shown extraordinary similarities between identical twins, even if they're separated at birth. This is usually taken to mean, well, it must be genetically programmed. And the normal debate is nature versus nurture, highly polarized, highly politicized debate. Entire edifices of speculation of sociobiology, selfish gene theory, and so on, are based on these identical twin studies that, through these extreme similarities, are taken to mean a high level of genetic determinism. Morphic resonance gives a completely different interpretation and makes the studies much, much more interesting and greatly reduces the genetic determinism. In fact, this whole theory means that genes are grossly overrated. Much inheritance occurs through morphic resonance, not genes. They just code for proteins. If you ask what organism in the past was most similar to me, then the answer has to be yourself. We're most similar to ourselves. Therefore, the most specific resonance working on us from the past is from our own past. That's why I think we have our own memories. We tune into ourselves more specifically than to other people. We've all been raised to believe memories are stored inside the brain. And that's because most people would say, where else can they be? It's just an assumption of brain research that they're all inside the brain. But what I'm suggesting is that the brain is not like a video recorder storing all the memories. It tunes into them. It's more like a TV receiver. Now, people have spent 100 years and vast amounts of money trying to find memories in the brain, and they've been extraordinarily unsuccessful. And I think there's a very simple explanation. They're not there. It's like me coming and trying to find out what TV program you watched yesterday by analyzing the wires and transistors of your TV set. I wouldn't find any traces. Now, of course, we know that damage to the brain can affect memory. That doesn't prove the memories are stored there. If I damage your TV set, I could affect the tuning, which channels you get, or the reception of the sound or the color. But it wouldn't prove all those programs you see are originating inside the TV set or are stored there. It would simply prove that that's essential for the reception and production of the picture on the screen. And so it is, I think, with our brains. I think just as genes are overrated, so brains are overrated. They don't do all the things they're made out to do. This gives a completely different view, you see, of memory, collective memory, evolution, the laws of nature as habits, and a different view of evolution itself, because what it suggests is that evolution is a kind of interplay between habit and creativity. Every single one of us is a creature of habit. Most of our habits are unconscious. The whole of nature, I think, is made up largely of unconscious habits. But sometimes habits can't continue. They're blocked by competition, by change of environment, by accidents, and so forth. Then we have to be creative or perish. Most people perish. Most animals perish. Creative ones come up with new ways of doing things. lots of new ways of doing things, not all of them very good ones. Natural selection weeds out the unsuccessful ones. The successful ones get repeated, and through morphic resonance become new habits. So this interplay of habit and creativity, I think, underlies human evolution, animal evolution, and indeed cosmic evolution. Well, time's up, and so I hardly need say these ideas are controversial. Obviously, there are quite a lot of people very wedded to the idea that the laws of nature are fixed. The universe was born with exactly the laws it's got today. Then you get into a whole debate, were they fine-tuned by some external mind? Is this just one of billions of universes and we just happen to have won the lottery ticket? That's the kind of debate that goes on in cosmology. All unnecessary if the laws have actually evolved within our universe. This is more radically evolutionary than the conventional theories in science. It makes chemistry an evolutionary science, physics an evolutionary science, not just biology. So I think that this idea, it's still, I would say, not widely accepted within the scientific world, but it's one of the ideas that we have to consider, and I think will be considered inevitably more and more as time goes on, because we can't live in an evolutionary universe with totally fixed laws. It leads to appalling paradoxes. Everything's evolving, and I think there's a kind of memory in nature. Thank you.